Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of the Black Westchester Presents the People Before Politics radio show. This is episode 265. My partner Damon K. Jones is not going to be with us today. Shout out to his wife. She just turned 50. Happy birthday, Montika. Shout out to other co-hosts, Dr. Bob, Robert Baskerville, working on some research papers. Not sure if he's going to chime in today, but we have my lovely co-host, Lorraine Lopez, in the building. Say hello to the people.
Hey, how you doing, people?
Okay.
Happy Flag Day. Happy every day. There's like a million holidays today, everybody.
Yes. And, I this whole thing, I'm just going to do a little intro before I introduce you, David. This whole thing going on right now has been keeping me very busy. We're a little more than 2 weeks out from the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We had a killing of a young man in a Wendy's drive-through in Atlanta. We had a killing of a young man in New Rochelle by the New Rochelle Police Department. And it's just, I had wrote an article before saying for the people whose family members have been killed and they still have seen no one go to jail for the killing of their family member, each of these incidences are like, it's like a paper cut that won't heal. And every time another one happens, it's like that cut opens back up. And, before it gets a chance to heal, that cut opens back up again. And now it's at a point where that cut is opened up so wide, a Band-Aid's not going to help. You're going to need stitches or something. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a big gash now. It's no longer a paper cut. And, you've seen protests. You've seen some provocative, some people out there trying to start trouble, but for the most part, you've seen peaceful protests in 50 states and over 20 countries. And like I said last week, I'm 54, so I was 2 when Martin Luther King died. So I was not around for the protest, the uprising in the 60s. So this is actually the biggest protest of its kind in my lifetime. And we're definitely seeing something. We're in a moment of history right now that is going to be recalled by generations after us, the way we talk about the 60s. This is that moment that we're living in right now. I want to applaud all of those people, the multiracial people of all creeds, colors, religions, ages, coming out and they have to make the choice between social distancing and social justice. And risking their life, not even from maybe retaliation from the cops or other people that want to start trouble, but their very health by participating in these protests where they can catch something and then bring it home, be asymptomatic and bring it home to their older relatives at home or something. But they still counted it that important that they came out to be heard. And I applaud everybody that's out there. And the young people, I applaud them because they are doing their thing. They're no longer sitting back. They're no longer trying to wait for the system, wait to let the system handle it. They're out there and they're making sure they're being heard. And I want to applaud them and I want to encourage them to keep it up. Don't let this be a minute. Let this be a beginning of a movement. And that's all I wanted to really say. Shout out to Sandy Barnaby. Shout out to Uncle Frank. Frank Trusco tuned in. Shout out to Alex Harrison. So I'm studying right now. I'm muting this. We'll catch the replay. Okay. Thank you for tuning in. So moving on. Lorraine, did you want to say anything before we get into our interview? Did you want to say what you've been up to in the last week or anything? Did you want to speak on anything before we get started?
No, I just want to piggyback on what you just said about the young folks, and I think it's very important to applaud the parents. the parents and a lot of these moms that are single mothers whose children are out there protesting, you know, I know they worry about him, but they have a lot to be proud of. I know I'm proud of my son who's out there. I'm very proud of him.
And the last thing I just want to say to all my people in Westchester, while we're protesting and we're saying their names, people like George Floyd over 1,200 miles away. And I forgot the young man in Atlanta. I've been listening to it. I just turned everything off today because I got tired of seeing it over and over and over yesterday. But to the young man in Atlanta. But we have cases of Black and brown people killed here in Westchester that no one has gone to jail for. And their families like Kenneth Chamberlain are still fighting for justice. Jonathan Maldonado's family is still fighting for justice. And even though they gave him a statue, the family of Mount Vernon police officer Christopher Ridley, no one's going to jail for any of these cases. And there's many more, Dario Tanner in Yonkers, Anthony Smith in Mount Vernon, Dan Roy, DJ Henry up in Pleasantville. This is happening right here, not just on the news, some far distant place away that we maybe have never been to. So we need to keep the names alive of the people who have died here. And when we protest for George Floyd, we need to hold up signs that say Kenneth Chamberlain. We need to say their names and Jonathan Maldonado and Dario Tanner and the list goes on. Raynette Turner died in police custody in Mount Vernon. The same month, 5 women died in police custody, and the most famous one was Sandra Bland that month. 5 women died that month in June. Matter of fact, it was June 4 years ago, 2016, I think. 5 women died nationwide in police custody, and Raynette Turner from Mount Vernon was the last one. So we got to just make sure we say the names of the ones here. We help keep those names alive so they don't get, those incidences don't get pushed up, swept up under the rug. Like those cases, we're still going to fight for those cases as well. Anyway, so thank you everybody for tuning in. That was my little opening, my little thoughts. But waiting patiently, we have our first interview for the day and our last interview in the candidates running for the congressional seat in the 17th district, a seat currently held by Nia Lowy, who is not running for re-election this year. And there was practically a soccer team full of candidates who came out in the beginning. And then there were so many more mentioned. What's her name was the front runner and never announced that she was ever running. Clinton's daughter, Chelsea. Chelsea was actually the front runner of this race in the beginning. As far as the media was concerned,
I wouldn't say front runner.
No,
she
was who they casted. I'm telling you, what the media casted her as the front runner until she came out publicly in like November, December, and said she has no desire to run for this race. And they was already putting a battle between Chelsea and Astorino. Actually, and Astorino never said he was going to run. So I was just like, then there was a bunch, and several have dropped out. The latest one, Catherine Parker, and then there were 7, and this is one of the 7, David Buchwald. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you, AJ and Lorraine, for having me on. You're right. We've come a long way since October when I entered this race. But that's true, not just, of course, in the congressional campaign. It's true as a society, and sometimes for not so good circumstances, and sometimes because we absolutely need to change things. So I really appreciate you having me on.
So in this new normal, which is why we're all sitting in our houses and not in the studio right now, this election has been very different than every other election. You can't exactly go out and shake hands and knock on doors, which was a big part of every campaign up to this point. Can't stand at the train station and just shake everybody's hands. But,
No, that's right. I mean, a lot of the normal things we would do to connect to voters are appropriately not being done as part of this campaign, but we found ways to connect as much as we can, whether that's phone calls, online virtual town halls. Had one with an epidemiologist, a gun safety expert, talking about the intersection between the pandemic and the gun violence epidemic, talking with a mental health professional about the importance of paying attention to those issues during this time. And of course, then some of the elected officials who've endorsed me during the campaign. This is a time for finding creative ways to get out information to voters and hope that they know how important it is to come out and participate in our democracy, particularly in this time. And as you know, AJ, primary day is June 23rd. People are already voting by absentee ballot and early voting. So this is very important.
So as you hear the noise in the background, I can hear it. I don't know if y'all can hear it. Hey. Thank you, excuse me. We have a 4-year-old in the house, and
Well, as I told you in advance, AJ, I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old here, so it'll be a minor miracle if you don't hear them at any point. But it's been a blessing to be able to spend a bunch of time with them, even while on the campaign trail.
Absolutely. So talking about how coronavirus has changed things, how we're all navigating through this new normal, this uncharted water, in all of our elections, in all of our seats, we now need candidates. We need a candidate who things are never going back exactly the way they were. We have new things we have to tackle, and we're going to have more. This will not be the last pandemic. We're going to have more situations like this. We may never go back to the large gatherings, movie theaters, concerts. I mean, everybody may have to find a new way to navigate through this. So as a candidate running for this office, running during a time, what things do you would like to do to prepare us for this new normal, to navigate through this new normal?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, I come at this as a current government official during the time of this pandemic. As a sitting state assembly member, and I represent 9 towns and 132,000 people here in Westchester County. Part of what running for Congress reminds me of is how important it is to have people in elective office who have experience dealing with various forms of crises. And of course, no one has dealt with a pandemic like this before, at least not in 100 years effectively, but that it is important to remember as an elected official to be humble enough to know that as much as we all as candidates come into these things with big plans and important things we want to accomplish, the reality of what affects our constituents is got to be what's first and foremost on our minds. And I knew that when I was elected to the state assembly in 2012, it was right after Superstorm Sandy, and recovering from that storm was a big issue. In March 2018, we had storms Riley and Quinn that knocked out power, sometimes for over a week, to hundreds of thousands of Westchester residents. And I formed a group called United Westchester, teaming up with local county, state, and federal officials. County Executive George Latimer was my co-chair, and we held Con Ed and NYSEG, the 2 utility companies that serve Westchester, to account for the fact that they had said that what had happened in Superstorm Sandy was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and here it was just 6 years later, and again, our system wasn't up to snuff. And that now, obviously, that's not the same as dealing with the pandemic, but it is a reminder that in government, you have to be prepared for responding to the needs of people. And I do consider it quite a blessing that even while running for a new office, I have the awesome responsibility of serving in office and helping people, whether it's with their health issues, getting PPE to frontline workers like nurses, whether it's helping people apply for unemployment insurance, or just connect with their loved ones in a time like this. So that's first and foremost what informs me. But what also informs me is the fact that our federal government has, fallen woefully short of what we as Americans expect, whether it's providing sufficient stockpiles of personal protective equipment, coordinating purchasing from around the country. So it's not states and localities and businesses all competing against each other, but also not having some of the fundamental provisions that keep people safe in time like this. So paid sick leave, which I'm proud to have been a co-sponsor of New York's law to provide paid sick leave for those affected by COVID-19. And we now have that law for all New Yorkers effective January 1st. At the federal level, we don't have a national paid sick leave law, and we should, because frankly, we want folks to either when they themselves are sick or a loved one is sick to be able to care for them and not feel they have to come back into work and affect others. And that would be true whether it was a more normal flu or coronavirus. And fundamentally, we need to make sure we have rules that work in this country for everyone and not just put profit first.
Absolutely. So
Before we go, wait, AJ, AJ, before
Yes.
we go on, can you just tell us real quickly where the district lays, and what's the demographics of your district, of the
Sure.
district that you're running in?
Sure. The Congressional district is all of Rockland County. That's about 40% of the district, plus most of central and northern Westchester. So basically I-287 corridor, Port Chester, Rybrook, Harrison, White Plains, and 2/3 of the town of Greenburgh, including many of the river towns like Dobbs Ferry and Irvington, but also moving farther north to North Castle, including Armonk, Newcastle, including Chappaqua, Mount Kisco, Mount Pleasant, including Pleasantville and Sleepy Hollow, Ossining, Cortland, Peekskill, and Yorktown. So
Wow.
it's a total of about 750,000 residents, north of 200,000 Democratic registered voters who are eligible to vote in the primary. Right now, as we have early voting and heading into the 23rd of June, and it is a diverse district. It is a district that has, some relatively large cities like White Plains, but also much more sparsely populated parts of our county. And I know from having served in the state assembly that there are far more things that unite us as a district, things that we care about: clean environment, protecting fundamental rights like the right to choose and the right of workers to organize, making sure that we support our education system. These are things that unite all of us here in the Lower Hudson Valley. And yes, of course, every community has its own individual things that make it special, but I'm very committed to making sure that we fight for the things that bring people to the Lower Hudson Valley and make sure that this is a great place to live, work, and raise a family.
So criminal justice reform is something that Black Westchester has been a champion of
course,
way
that's what it
before
should be.
this. Way before this. It's everybody's jumping on the bandwagon now. Everybody has a speech. Everybody has something to say. But we've been saying, I forgot who. I don't quote Al Sharpton often, but Al Sharpton said, if they would have passed, they would have made legislation against police crimes when Eric Garner got choked. George Floyd may not have died like that. If the cops went to jail in the Eric Garner situation, and you saw that as nationally as you saw the video of his death, but because nobody has ever gone to jail, and that's because even though the NYPD banned the chokehold, it's against policies and procedures for the NYPD. It is not against. There's no law against that. He didn't actually break the law that they can convict him of. So we need legislators that are going to define and pass police crimes. If you violate your policies, your procedures, and your training, then it is no less than a crime, and you should go to jail. And that's only going to happen if our legislators.
Which is why I'm pleased to report, AJ, that this week the state legislature, myself included, passed a bill to not just ban chokeholds, but to make it a crime in New York. That's
the Eric Garner Act or something?
I believe it is named after Mr. Garner, appropriately so.
But does that law apply to a knee on your neck too?
That particular law applies to chokeholds. We have a series of other.
Gotta do better.
Well, in fairness, that was a part of a package of measures that we established this week. So, for example, we have put in place a permanent rule in New York that there'll be an independent investigation of every police-involved death. I've called for that to be enacted nationwide. Every police-involved death and shooting should not be investigated by a local district attorney. It should be investigated independently. Here in New York, we do that through our independently elected attorney general. But I have been someone
that also needs to be passed as a law because it's actually only an executive order. And if Cuomo doesn't win this next election, then his executive order goes.
No, I totally agree. Which is why this week we didn't stop relying on the governor's executive order. It is now a law. This week, the state legislature did this. I'm pleased to have voted for every bill in this package. But you're also right, AJ. It should not have taken the latest tragic circumstances with Mr. Garner to have spurred us to action. In 2014, I was the only legislature in the New York State legislature to actually vote against a bill that I believe strengthened 50A. 50A is the law that we just repealed this week that shields police from a public accountability when it comes to their misconduct. In 2016, I voted to reform 50A, and there weren't enough folks, particularly in the Republican IDC-led state Senate, who wanted to have that debate and dialogue. Thankfully now, we have Andrea Stewart-Cousins as our majority leader in the state Senate. I'm proud to have served under and voted for Carl Hastie to be our Speaker of the State Assembly. And they, with Governor Cuomo and my colleagues in the state legislature, we are now making real progress. And it's true that it is only a first step. It's certainly not a final step. And that first step, if it had been able to be taken earlier, been all the better. But we have to make sure that as we are out in the streets, and I say we because I've been joining in a number of protests and vigils over the last few weeks, not my first ones on the subject, but ones that are coming now fast and furious. As we move forward week after week, and inevitably to some degree, maybe because coronavirus gets under control, things start appearing as if they're returning to normal. We have to remember, no, we can't just go back to where we were. We have to move forward and, rededicate ourselves to having a more just society where institutional racism is not tolerated.
And I want to be careful. I want to be clear on my wording and fair to you all as to what Lorraine just said. The people were calling for the chokehold to be made illegal. The people were calling specifically for that. Oh, it needs to be illegal for them to do a chokehold. But that's why I'm using the words police crimes when you violate your policies, your procedures, and your training, and period. And then if that happens and it causes the death of someone, that is a crime. That has to be defined as a crime, and the officers should be charged with a crime and should go to jail. And until officers nationwide see other officers going to jail, not only will you have less of it, but you'll have the other cop with them saying, whoa, 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 you're not jamming me up. He's gonna say that to his partner and he's gonna slow him down. When a partner gets out of control, because they also have a duty to intervene, and that is not, they're not prosecuted for not taking their duty to intervene. So that's why I'm specifically saying changing legislation, defining a police crime, and then making those crimes illegal, and that will cover. See, when we said the chokehold, that was for Eric Garner. It didn't cover the George Floyd thing. But what I'm talking about will cover the next situation if there is a next one. You understand what I'm saying?
I totally get you, because
New York needs to lead the way.
But I totally hear you. in 2014, in addition to voting against that bill that I believe would have strengthened 50A, I also voted, I was one of only 4 members of the state legislature to vote against a bill that would have made it more difficult to discipline members of law enforcement. So I hear you. I've been calling for transparency and accountability in government for a long time. And the reality is, until recently, there was a lot of desire to, frankly, more, keep issues, I think, effectively hidden instead of
Sweep it under the
exposing
rug.
them for what they are.
Right, you should be transparent. I'm looking at the comments at the same time. The one other thing, and then I'm going to move off of this though. One other thing is police officers. Now, I applaud Minnesota. They fired him within 24 hours. Atlanta, the police chief stepped down and the officer, I believe, was fired within 24 hours. That up until this point, before all this national protest and stuff, that was unheard of. But my problem with that is that that's still not enough, because in Cleveland, the officer who killed that little boy, Tamir Rice, he was fired and he is now working at another department somewhere else. If you're fired for something like this, you should be on a list and you should not be able to work in law enforcement. You should not just be able to be rewarded with another job in another department after you've been terminated for stuff like this. And I think that also has to be legislated.
Well, I think we can take some measure of leadership from Governor Cuomo, who this week announced that there will no longer be any state dollars given to any police department in the state unless they put together a plan to actually take these sorts of things into account. I believe that federal funding for police departments and other law enforcement should also be attached to requirements to what those departments are doing to preserve civil rights. Those are the rights that the federal government in our Constitution is most in charge of ensuring. And there are some things we should be doing affirmatively as a federal government. We should be investing more in our public defenders' offices. Those are the offices that supply, for many folks, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. And we don't do that nearly as much as we, frankly, fund prosecutors' offices. And so I feel that there is an affirmative burden on those of us running for Congress to make sure that we have platforms that speak to these issues and make sure that we are part of the solution going forward. Myself, whoever has the honor of representing Rockland, Westchester counties, starting in January 2021, after to succeed Nita Lowey, which is who served our area for a long time.
We live in one of the richest counties, if not the richest county in the country. So a lot of your district, upper northern Westchester, does not like to talk about things like homelessness, HUD housing, affordable housing. They act like homelessness does not exist. Everything is pushed downstate to areas. Lorraine lives in Yonkers. I live in Mount Vernon, which are dumping grounds for the other communities that don't want these things in their community, yet cities like Mount Vernon are not getting the resources and getting the resources pulled away. Even the probation office here was taken away because they supposedly had to cut for funding. But then I read that they added another level to they added to the Peekskill probation office. Like they're stripping the resources, but they're dumping stuff here. HUD was supposed to be a certain amount of HUD housing in all of the municipalities. As Reno said, yeah, we've done our job. Yeah, Mount Vernon put 4 more buildings up. That was their job that they did. That it wasn't for the county. So where do you stand on the whole HUD thing?
Well, I think this is
affordable housing, which leads to homelessness.
Sure. Well, this is part of having served in the state assembly now 7.5 years. I've had the privilege of working with a Westchester County delegation in the state assembly. And we work together on a host of issues affecting our region. And part of that is each of us trying to look out for each other's districts because we have a lot of common interests. So when I argue for increased education funding, that is in part for schools and educators and students in Mount Vernon and Yonkers. It's part of why Gary Pretlow and Nader Sage, who together represent Mount Vernon and Yonkers, have endorsed my candidacy. I believe in working together with colleagues in government, not just at my own level of government, but county, state, local, federal, all together. And that's part of why, frankly, over 80 elected officials and organizations, including Friends in Labor and local Democratic Party leaders, have been supportive of my campaign. And anyone who goes to davidbuchwaldforcongress.com can see that list of endorsers. And I think
You have a lot. I went on. Yeah, you have a lot of endorsements. Endorsements. I went on.
Most recently, County Executive George Latimer endorsed my candidacy, which I'm most honored about. And but part of it is that fundamental belief that, yes, of course, you represent your own district, but you also are one of the few people who can actually speak to the needs of the region you represent. And you cannot be an advocate for Rockland, Westchester without advocating for Yonkers and Mount Vernon and New Rochelle and think places that are our neighbors. So many folks I live in White Plains, which, yes, is the largest city in the 17th Congressional District where I live, but it shares a lot of issues with other cities around New York State, and we have to figure out how do we solve those things together. In a legislature, you can't get anything formally done just by yourself. You rely on working in partnership with colleagues, whether they're from neighboring districts or halfway across the country in Congress, and you find those areas of common ground. It's part of why I sincerely hope that we have a solid Democratic majority in the House, that we take back the Senate, and we have a new president come January, because it'll be obviously even easier to build those coalitions within the Democratic Party, and all the more advocate for students and housing and things that we absolutely need throughout the Lower Hudson Valley.
Now and you just said, what you just said about on the federal level, taking back the Senate, possibly then having a Democratic president and having the Democratic, control of the House. We have that set up here in New York. We have a Democratic Democratic governor, and the Democrats control the Senate and the Assembly. So in the Black and the brown communities, there's a certain expectation, because now it can no longer be, well, the Republicans didn't go along with me, so we couldn't get this through. There's going to be certain, now that you have it, you know what I'm saying? People are going to be expecting a lot,
which is part of why.
And it would be a microcosm of what we're looking for on the federal level. We need to see what's going on here.
We have seen in New York the import of that first vote of the legislative term, when you choose leadership in each house, is the most important single vote you take as a legislator. I've been pleased for a number of years to be voting for Carl Hastie as our speaker, but in the state Senate, Andrew Stewart-Cousins only got to be the majority leader, not just the Democratic leader, because the people in the 2018 elections spoke loudly, threw out Republicans, also threw out a lot of members of the then IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference, and we now have a reinvigorated unified Democratic majority that's getting things done in the state Senate. And a lot got done last year. A lot is getting done this year. And there's always more to do. But it is, I think, notable that one of the candidates for this congressional seat, the other elected official in the race, State Senator David Carlucci from Rockland, was a member of the IDC at a time when he could have been a member of the Democratic Conference supporting Andrea Stewart-Cousins. He wasn't. and more importantly, that blocked crucial legislation here in New York from getting done. I'm honored to be on your show, and one of the 6 candidates you've had on your show, but there are 7. And for whatever reason, Senator Carlucci decided not to be on your show. Rest assured that with me, if I have the honor of being elected, when you want me on, I'll be as accessible as I possibly can be. This is too important to a district to just simply say, I'm going to only focus on one part and not try to speak to everyone across the entire district.
Lorraine, you got a question? Lorraine, you had a
About
question?
5 minutes ago, AJ. Topic is already passed. You
Okay.
gotta let me ask these questions when we're talking about him. You know
I
what?
know, but
Let me ask you a
sometimes
question. Wait. Nita Lowy, she hasn't endorsed anyone yet, right?
That
Any
is
word
true.
that?
That is true. I interned for the Congresswoman 23 years ago, and she's been
Really?
a stalwart advocate of the area. But for now, she makes decisions on her own, which is as it should be. I just feel that I'd be somebody who both is up for continuing her legacy and creating some of my own. And that's ultimately, it's going to be up to the people of the district to decide.
That was my actually next question. You led into it. She's loved in this district. She's done a lot of work. What would you do if elected to continue her legacy? And then again, to continue to begin to build your own legacies, providing some of the things that maybe are needed in the district.
Sure. Well, look.
And also, what would you do differently?
I'd be happy to answer both those questions, AJ and Lorraine. I think Congresswoman Lowy has been an advocate for our area and has done things of national import that maybe too often she doesn't even get credit for now. She's been pushing for more scientific research into basic health and fighting of diseases in a way that I think is crucial for us. And her faith in science and expertise is something that I wish this White House shared. When I interned for Congresswoman Lowy, she was an advocate for lowering to 0.08 the standard for drunk driving in this country. And she successfully did that a few years later, and I believe she has saved lives as a result of the legislation she enacted. That's something that we should be most grateful for. But ultimately, some of the things that she's pushed for that hasn't been able to accomplish, that I will continue pushing for, things like requiring Medicare and Medicaid to negotiate with Big Pharma the drug prices that Americans pay through those programs. Right now, there's literally a law that says, despite the fact that Medicare and Medicaid do bulk purchasing of prescription drugs, they're not allowed to use that buying power to lower the costs for Americans and American taxpayers. I think that's wrong. I believe that we should have even more emphasis on issues like global warming, including adopting the Green New Deal. I was a co-sponsor and voted for New York's version of the Green New Deal that we adopted last year. I think we also have to have a renewed emphasis at the federal level on gun safety. We've adopted nationwide leading reforms here in New York, starting with the New York SAFE Act, which was my first vote on a piece of legislation as a New York State Assembly member, the strongest anti-gun violence law in the country. And since then, we've done safe storage laws, red flag laws, expanded background checks, all while Washington has done hardly anything, while the gun violence epidemic has gotten even worse. So we do have to make sure that even in the vein of Nita Lowy, that we have renewed emphasis on a number of the issues that are crucial to us, while also dealing with, of course, the fallout of COVID-19 and making sure that we address some of the more institutional problems with racism in our society.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a quick comment, I was going to ask you that one of the things I was going to ask you about, where do you stand on that whole Green New Deal thing? One of the things I think COVID has provided for us, doctors tell us it's good for us to fast and clean out our system every now and then. You know what I mean? And this is like the earth got a pause, like a chance to reset. To you know what I mean? There's a less pollution put out there.
We're in the middle of all this now, so we don't have the perspective of history yet. But it is, I think, becoming clear that the Great Awakening that we're going through as a society is in part, one of the elements was we were all, or most of us, except the frontline workers for whom we should be tremendously grateful for, we're all mostly home, being confined, and that did prepare us for watching on television and learning all the more about what happened to George Floyd and being outraged because we were observing it more directly, and as a society had an opportunity to come out and vent our frustration. The contrast between the public outpouring of disgust versus the heretofore limited interactions with people because of social distancing, that I think, the two are inevitably going to be linked in history. And that doesn't mean that any of us would have wished this coronavirus on our society, but it did create an environment in which folks could express themselves. The mere gathering is in and of itself an expression of the importance of this issue. And that's true in a way now that I don't think it would have been true before.
I think with the less trucks and the less planes and all that stuff, and it could just be me in my head, but the air smells a little fresher in Mount Vernon right now. Like, even the air smells, like you can tell the difference.
You can hear the birds better too.
You can hear the birds better. So a couple of kind of like speed round questions.
Sure.
Criminal. We talked about criminal justice. Election reform, campaign reform. Elections now are won by who has the most money, sometimes not who's the best candidate. I know several candidates from even the smallest level, library trustee, on up to, the positions you're running for and higher. Some can't afford to run, and they can't afford to compete to even have an even playing field. And we don't always get the best candidates in office because some people are allowed to grossly outspend others. Do you think we need campaign reform, campaign finance reform?
There's no doubt in my mind that we do. In my record in New York, but also I've called for federally, and I have a page on my website about ending corruption, and part of that is the corrupting influence of money in politics. Overturning Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision that said that corporations have an absolute right to effectively electioneer through their spending. There are a host of reforms, and I'm pleased the House Democrats, through what's called the For the People Act, H.R. 1, have been taking a stand in favor of campaign finance reforms and other things like independent redistricting that will make our democracy better.
The current occupier of the White House has shown us, if nothing else, the need for real leadership, especially in crisis. I've never really been the biggest Andrew Cuomo fan, but it's a stark contrast between the example of leadership he's shown and the lack of leadership we have on the top. We're looking to all our leaders now for that kind of leadership. So if elected, speak on, we'll have future pandemics, we're going to have future other unforeseen situations, would you like to speak?
Yeah, no, I think one of the great contrasts between Governor Cuomo and President Trump is the transparency that the governor shows and the
big word,
reliance on, yes, and the reliance on basic scientific facts. I was a physics major in college. I've always believed that policymaking should be based on facts and science as much as possible. And this president, before the pandemic, whether it was putting lobbyists into key federal agencies like the EPA, and then roll back climate change initiatives, or during the pandemic, where he's tried to minimize the role of government experts, say at the CDC, I think has really put us back. And you know, it is important for our next Congress member to be willing to hold any chief executive to account in having robust oversight and making sure that the people's interests are being put first. That's part of why, as a New York State Assembly member and a former tax attorney, I didn't just stand up on top of a soapbox on April 15th, 2017 and call for Donald Trump to release his tax returns. I rolled up my sleeves and I passed a law to allow New York State to turn over to Congress the tax returns of top government officials. That's a law that Donald Trump is now suing to stop the implementation of. So we absolutely need to make sure that leaders in high office are held to account. This transparency and accountability, that's what I've often been about.
Income equality seems to be a very big top talking point nationally, locally, federally. It studies, and I don't have it in front of me, women make far less than their counterparts, their male counterparts in the same positions. And also there's racial income equality. What would you do if elected to?
Well, the money aspects of that. First is to have a tax code that stops favoring wealthy interests over the common working men and women in this country. As I mentioned, I'm a former tax attorney. And so when I put up on David Buchwald for Congress.com a tax plan, it isn't just for show. It's something I'm very committed to. We absolutely need to do things like remove the preference for capital gains over ordinary income. In other words, the money you make through the stock market is taxed at a lower rate than the money you work through a regular job. And that's wrong. We should also be making sure that we have multimillionaires tax brackets so that folks who can afford to contribute more to society do so. But in addition to that, and you get to a very good point, AJ, there are some more fundamental aspects. It's not just the rich versus the poor. It's also within classes, there being the effects of discrimination in our society. In New York, we've implemented a Fair Pay Act that makes sure that, particularly for gender discrimination, but other bases of discrimination, that isn't a legal basis for distinguishing on salaries. But we have to do far more than that. It's part of why I've carried legislation in the New York State Assembly on housing discrimination on behalf of our Division of Human Rights. We have to make sure that with regards to employment and other policies, that we are not just creating a vicious cycle whereby, those who don't already have authority and power and wealth in our society are not able to achieve, and those who do have wealth perpetuate their wealth through the laws that they're able to influence.
So taxing the rich per se, that's not going to be popular with a lot of the more wealthier people that live in your district in upper northern Westchester. That's
well, look, I have to say my tax plan has been on my website for months. I'm somebody who believes, we have to create a fair system. Part of it, also AJ, is we have a system that right now is not fair to New York and New Yorkers. The SALT deduction, for example, which taxes state income taxes and local property taxes, and creates a system of double taxation that Donald Trump and his Republican enablers reduced the SALT deduction in 2017. We have to reverse that because it harms New Yorkers more and it harms particularly residents of Rockland, Westchester counties, the two highest tax counties in the entire country. But we also have to marry that with a fairer tax system. And I am prepared and have, during the course of my assembly career, to actually defend my positions to folks. I think, part of being an actual legislator, having to not just as part of a campaign, but also as part of governing, be accountable to people you represent, beyond the Democratic Party, independents and Republicans and so forth, is, a crucial aspect of things. And I defeated a Republican predecessor in the state assembly. And then I've won 3 times since then. In 2018, my most recent reelection, I won my assembly district by 40 points. So I'm pretty confident of my ability to promote democratic progressive ideals and build on electoral success. And it's not all my doing. I'm sure some of the gains for Democrats have been because of the man in the White House. Some of them because of great local candidates who are running on town boards and village boards across the area. But, the blue wave has hit Westchester, but it hasn't hit Rockland. We do need a Congress member who's going to keep building up and down the ballot on behalf of our party going forward.
One of a topic that I know is close to Lorraine's heart, when we talk about education, and we talk about this new normal, they're talking about a second wave, possibly. We're going to find out in the next couple of weeks what the result of those states opening up early was. And then I'm sure there will be some negative aspects of the protests, because there were people out there without masks. I mean, most people did. But that being said, there's no guarantee school will go back to school as we know it. And in September, and we found out a lot of kids could not keep up at home because they didn't have tablets. The schools couldn't afford or did not provide them. I know Lorraine has been part of a coalition that has provided a lot of tablets in the region for a lot of people that need it. What are your ideas as far as going forward, knowing that we don't know where we're going, and we're fooling ourselves if we believe everybody's going back to school and school's going to be the way it was in September, the way it was before Corona?
No, you're right. We don't know all the circumstances. Part of it is, what we're doing here in New York, but frankly, and we're already seeing this, whereas it used to be that other states would talk about, one, to keep in quarantine anyone who traveled to their state from New York. Now the shoe soft seems to be on the other foot, where we have to wonder what happens when someone travels here from Florida or from Texas or whatnot. And obviously, we're not at the point yet of making any of those decisions. But as we get closer to the fall, we will have some very important decisions to make when it comes to education. And it's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach across the entire state. Some of this is making sure that local educators and school districts have insight based on the physical layout of their buildings and the circumstances they have. But fundamentally, we do need a federal government that is supportive of there being some sort of nationwide standard when it comes to health, and this whole concept of everyone is on their own, which is sort of the president's approach, I think puts things backwards. He has a false sense that this is a question about people's health versus the economy operating. Well, you know what? Right now, if you're a business that's open in Nashville, where my sister-in-law lives, and you've just heard that because of the renewed cases of coronavirus, your economy isn't going to be able to proceed to its next phase of reopening. Well, it might, with a virus like this, it's far easier to figure things out early on, to create the right procedures, and then monitor as the governor's doing. And that's, part of what we're going to have to do. And I think it's fair to say we don't know where we're going to be in the fall when it comes to school at any age. And I've got two young daughters, ages 3 and 5. The oldest of which starts public school in White Plains in the fall. At least that's the plan. And so we're all very closely monitoring the situation. I just hope that everyone in the meantime stays as safe as possible. There's one thing that's clear. Being in New York right now, we're able to have more of these public gatherings, including protests, in part because New Yorkers are doing the right thing, wearing masks, taking care of themselves as much as possible. And so our numbers continue going down. And I only hope that, you know, we're on the definitive downside of this in New York. And the greatest concern we have is what happens in other states. Let's do the right thing here.
What about technology? I mean, again, providing the school with the resources. We're moving into a technological world. Everything is about technology. And our schools are not equipping our kids to prepare them for the future.
Well, look, this is part of why I've been a proponent of foundation aid and the Campaign for Fiscal Equity's push for getting more resources to school districts that really need it across New York State. Now, the federal government has a little less of a role to play when it comes to education spending, but we don't provide enough Title I spending. We don't provide enough funding for the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act compared to what the federal government promised. And so I do hope that as a federal official, I'll be able to pursue increased funding for education, but also work with state colleagues to make sure that resources are being allocated in a fair way.
Okay, so we're coming kind of close to the end, but before I forget, I wanted to give you a chance to give everybody your website, social media, how people can get in touch with you. You know, from what I understand, there is a large portion, a large popular part of the people that are still not decided on who they're going for. So how can people find out more about you, contact you?
Sure. Well, you can find out more and contact me through my website, davidbuchwald4congress.com. That's DAVIDBUCHWALD and the word for FOR Congress.com. But also you can reach me on Facebook. It's facebook.com/vote.buchwald. Again, Buchwald is BUCH, even though it's spelled, it sounds like it has a K in it.
Yes, I've done that 3 times. And writing your name, I've put a K, and I'm like,
hey, you won't be the first, and I've heard worse. Don't worry, AJ. On Twitter, it's at David Buchwald. We're on Instagram as well, David Buchwald for Congress. This is a campaign where if you want to get involved, we will be extremely honored. Sign up to be a volunteer, make phone calls in these last 9 days, and most importantly, remind your friends and neighbors to go vote. They can do that early. It's many sites across Westchester and Rockland counties. Contact your Board of Elections. We can still, until Tuesday the 16th, request an absentee ballot, or you can vote in person on June 23rd. Just know that your regular polling place might not be open. The Board of Elections has consolidated polling places significantly, so just make sure you're going to the right place or go to the early voting site in advance now through Sunday the 21st.
You mentioned the mail-in ballots. A lot of people are concerned. There have been great concerns about, and the president's talking about there's going to be voter tampering and all that. Would you like to speak on that briefly? And
yeah,
then,
I think
anything else I didn't ask you?
Like the president on this, like most things, is misguided. There is no evidence in states that have mail-in balloting on a regular basis that there's an increased voter fraud there. Also in New York, we have it right now for everyone because of the coronavirus, right? People are not able to go door to door, collect ballots, forge signatures, things like that. So particularly under these circumstances, people should feel that's a secure way to do things. But if they have a personal concern about voting by mail, that's why we established early voting. I was a co-sponsor of the early voting law in New York. You know, they say the phrase vote early, vote often. Well, in New York, we took care of the vote early part. I'll leave it to others if they want to vote often. That probably isn't advisable, but I hope if you're voting for David Buchwald, and we'll go from there and then do that this June for the primary, and then in November send a message back to the president about what voting's all about.
Anything I didn't ask you or that you wanna say in your last words? Anything you wanna get out to people?
Yeah, I just appreciate the fact that there've been so many supporters, whether it's New York State Nurse Association or 32BJ or folks who are my colleagues in government, Westchester County Executive George Latimer, County Board Chairman Ben Boykin, County Legislator Colin Smith, but also individual mayors and supervisors who've gotten to know me over time. And I really feel that this is a race where, the more people who turn out, the better. And, those of you who, for some reason are considering a certain state senator from Rockland County, just know his colleague in the state Senate, James Skoufis, who represents the other two towns in Rockland County, has endorsed me. So I think we get to see that this is a race where, you're right, people are trying to make decisions and figure out who is the best candidate to take on folks who haven't been upholding democratic ideals. But I think in David Buchwald, you found your man.
I thank you for your time. We're about to move into our next interview. I wish you well.
Thank you.
If you win, I hope that you come back.
I gladly will.
Before the November election, and if you win the whole thing, I hope that you utilize Black Westchester to get the word out that you need to get out to the people.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Lorraine. Be well, be safe, everyone.